is Wolfie here for Reading with Beverly Wolfie. Thank you all for your patience. I apologize for missing the live yesterday. I am going to be going down to once a week on Saturdays, right? But I will hopefully read more than one chapter at a time, okay? I've got my little reading lamp here so that I can actually see what I'm doing. So, as you all know, Almanzo isn't a great part of Laura's story until they actually get to know each other later on in life. So this is just Almanzo's story when he was a kid, so we can get a picture of how he was raised, right? So now, I guess the last one was Sunday. Hi. All right. Chapter 9. We are reading, this is Little House Live, Farmer Boy, Chapter 9, Breaking the Calves. Almanzo had been so busy filling the ice house that he had no time to give the calves another lesson. This light is not working for me. Hang on. Oh, it's better over there. Okay. So on Monday, he said, Father, I'm reading. You know what my problem is? I got the wrong glasses on for reading. Those are my computer glasses. Okay, sorry, I'll start that again. Almanzo had been so busy filling the ice house that he had no time to give the calves another lesson. So on Monday morning, he said, Father, I can't go to school today, can I? If I don't work those calves, they'll forget how to act. Father tugged his beard and twinkled his eyes. Seems as though a boy might forget his lessons, too, he said. Almanzo had not thought of that. He thought a minute and said, Well, I have had more lessons than the calves, and besides, they're younger than I be. Father looked solemn, but his beard had a smile under it, and Mother exclaimed, Oh, let the boy stay home if he wants. It won't hurt him for once in a way, and he's right. The calves do need breaking. So Almanzo went to the barn and called the little calves into the frosty air. He fitted the little yoke over their necks. He held up the bows and put the bow pins in and tied a rope around Star's small nubs of horns. He did this all by himself. All that morning, he backed little by little around the barnyard, shouting, Get up! And whoa! Star and Bright came eagerly when he yelled, Get up, and they stopped when he said, Whoa, and licked up the pieces of carrot from his woolly mittens. Now and then, he ate a piece of raw carrot himself. The outside part is the best. It comes off in a thick, solid ring and is sweet. The inside part is juicier and clear like yellow ice, but it has a thin, sharp taste. At noon, Father said the calves had been worked enough for one day, and that afternoon he would show Almanzo how to make a whip. They went into the woods, and Father cut some moosewood boughs. Almanzo carried them up to Father's workroom over the woodshed, and Father showed him how to peel off the bark in strips, and how to braid a whiplash. First, he tied the ends of the 5 strips together, and then he braided them in a round, solid braid. All that afternoon, he sat beside Father's bench. Father shaved shingles, and Almanzo carefully braided his whip, just as Father braided the big black snake whips of leather. Excuse me. Okay. While he turned and twisted the strips, the thin outer bark fell off in flakes, leaving the soft white inside bark. The whip would have been white, except that Almanzo's hands left a few smudges. He could not finish it before chore time, and the next day he had to go to school. But he braided his whip every evening by the heater until the lash was 5 feet long. Then Father lent him his jackknife, and Almanzo whittled a wooden handle and bound the lash to it with strips of moosewood bark. The whip was done. It would be a perfectly good whip until it dried brittle in the hot summer. Almanzo could crack it almost as loudly as Father cracked the black snake whip. And he did not finish it a minute too soon, for already he needed to give the calves their next lesson. Now he had to teach them to turn left and right, to left when he shouted "ha," and to turn right when he shouted "gee." As soon as the whip was ready, he began. Every Saturday morning he spent in the barnyard teaching Star and Bright. He never whipped them, he only cracked his whip. He knew you could never teach an animal anything if you struck it, or even shouted at it angrily. He must always be gentle and quiet and patient, even when they made mistakes. Star and Bright must like him and trust him and know he would never hurt them. For if they were once afraid of him, they would never be good, willing, hard-working oxen. Now they always obeyed him when he shouted, "Get up!" and "Whoa!" So he did not stand in front of them any longer. He stood at Star's left. Star was next to him, so Star was the nigh ox. Bright was on the other side. "Howard, what are you doing, dear?" "Not my brown paper, right?" "Okay, thank you." Bright was on the other side of Star, so Bright was the off ox. Almanzo shouted "Gee!" and cracked the whip with all his might close to Star's head. Star dodged to get away from it, and that turned both calves to the right. Then Almanzo said, "Get up!" and let them walk a little way quietly. Then he made the whiplash curl in the air and crack loudly on the other side of Bright, and with that crack he yelled, "Ha!" Bright swerved away from the whip, and that turned both calves to the left. Sometimes they jumped and started to run, and Almanzo said, "Whoa," in a deep, solemn voice like father's. And if he didn't stop, he ran after them and headed them off. When that happened, he had to make them practice "get up" and "whoa" again. For a long time, he had to be very patient. One very cold Saturday morning, when the calves were feeling frisky, they ran away the first time he cracked the whip. They kicked up their heels and ran bawling around the barnyard. When he tried to stop them, they ran right over him, tumbling him into the snow. They kept right on running because they liked to run. He could hardly do anything with them that morning, and he was so mad that he shook all over and tears ran down his cheeks. He wanted to yell at those mean calves and kick them and hit them over the head with the butt of his whip, but he didn't. He put up the whip and tied the rope again to Star's horns, and he made them go twice around the barnyard, starting when he yelled "Get up" and stopping when he said "Whoa." Afterward, he told Father about it because he thought anyone who was as patient as that with calves was patient enough to be allowed to at least currycomb the colts. But Father didn't seem to think of that. All he said was, "That's right, son. Slow and patient does it. Keep on that way and you'll have a good yoke of oxen yet." The very next Saturday, Star and Bright obeyed him perfectly. He did not need to crack the whip because they obeyed his shout, but he cracked it anyway. He liked to. That Saturday, the French boys, Pierre and Louis, came to see Almanzo. Pierre's father was Lazy John, and Louis's father was French Joe. They lived with many brothers and sisters in the little houses in the woods and went fishing and hunting and berrying. They never had to go to school, but often they came to work or play with Almanzo. They watched while Almanzo showed off his calves in the barnyard. Star and Bright were behaving so well that Almanzo had a splendid idea. He brought out his beautiful birthday hand sled, and with an auger, he bored a hole through the crosspiece between the runners in front. Then he took one of Father's chains and a linchpin from Father's big bobsled, and he hitched up the calves. There was a little iron ring underneath their yoke in the middle, just like the rings in the big yokes. Almanzo stuck the handle of his sled through this ring, and as far as the handle's little crosspiece. The crosspiece kept it from going too far through the ring. When he fastened one end of the chain to the ring and the other end, he wound around the linchpin in the hole of the crossbar and fastened it. When Star and Bright pulled, they would pull the sled by the chain. When they stopped, the sled's stiff handle would stop the sled. "Now, Louis, you get on the sled," Almanzo said. No, I'm biggest, Pierre said, pushing Louis back. I get first ride. You better not, said Almanzo. When the calves feel the heft, they're liable to run away. Let Louis go first because he's lighter. No, I don't want to, said Louis. I guess you better, Almanzo told him. No, said Louis. Be you scared, said Almanzo. Yes, he's scared, said Pierre. I am not scared, said Louis. I just don't want to. He's scared, sneered Pierre. Yes, he's scared, Almanzo said. Louis said he was not either scared. Yes, you are too scared, Almanzo and Pierre said. They said he was a fraidy cat. They said he was a baby. Pierre told him to go back to his mama, so finally Louis sat carefully on the sled. Almanzo cracked his whip and shouted, Get up! Star and Bright started and stopped. They tried to turn around to see what was behind them, but Almanzo sternly said, Get up! Again, and this time they started and kept on going. Almanzo walked beside them, cracking his whip and shouting, Gee! And he drove them clear around the barnyard. Pierre ran after the sled and got on too, and still the calves behaved perfectly. So Almanzo opened the barnyard gate. Pierre and Louis quickly got off the sled and said, They'll run away. Almanzo said, I guess I know how to handle my own calves. He went back to his place beside Star. He cracked the whip and shouted, Get up! And he drove Star and Bright straight out of the safe barnyard into the big, wide, glittering world outside. Haw! He shouted. Gee! And he drove them past the house. He drove them out onto the road. They stopped when he shouted, Whoa! Pierre and Louis were excited now. They piled onto the sled, but Almanzo made them slide back. He was going to ride too. He sat in front. Pierre held on to him, and Louis held on to Pierre. Their legs stuck out, and they held them stiffly up above the snow. Almanzo proudly cracked his whip and shouted, Get up! Up went Star's tail, up went Bright's tail, up went their heels. The sled bounced into the air, and then everything happened all at once. Bah! Bah! Said Star. Bah! Said Bright. Okay, that wasn't really good. Bah! That's more like it. Right in Almanzo's face were flying hooves and swishing tails, and close overhead were galumping hindquarters. Whoa! Yelled Almanzo. Whoa! Bah! Said Bright. Bah! Said Star. It was far swifter than sliding downhill. Trees and snow and calves' hind legs were all mixed up. Every time the sled came down, Almanzo's teeth crashed together. Bright was running faster than Star. They were going off the road. The sled was turning over. Almanzo yelled, Ha! Ha! He went headlong into the deep snow, yelling, Ha! His open mouth was full of snow. He spit it out and wallowed, scrambling up. Everything was still. The road was empty. The calves were gone. The sled was gone. Pierre and Louis were coming up out of the snow. Louis was swearing in French, but Almanzo paid no attention to him. Pierre sputtered and wiped the snow from his face and said, Sacre bleu! I think you say you drive your calves. They not run far away, eh? Far down the road, almost buried in the deep drifts by the mound of snow over the stone fence, Almanzo saw the calves' red backs. They did not run away, he said to Pierre. They only ran. There they be. He went down to look at them. Their heads and their backs were above the snow. The yoke was crooked, and their necks were askew in the bows. Their noses were together, and their eyes were large and wondering. They seemed to be asking each other, What happened? Pierre and Louis helped dig the snow away from them and the sled. Almanzo straightened the yoke and the chain, and he stood in front of them and said, Get up, while Pierre and Louis pushed them from behind. The calves climbed into the road, and Almanzo headed them towards the barn. They went willingly. Almanzo walked beside Star, cracking his whip and shouting, and everything he told them to do, they did. Pierre and Louis walked behind. They would not ride. Almanzo put the calves in their stall and gave them a nubbin of corn. each a nubbin of corn. He wiped the yoke carefully and hung it up. He put the whip on its nail, and he wiped the chain and the linchpin and put them where Father had left them. Then he told Pierre and Louis that they could sit behind him, and they slid downhill on the sled till chore time. That night, Father asked him, "You have some trouble this afternoon, son?" "No," said Almanzo. "I just found out I have to break Star and Bright to drive when I ride." So he did that in the barnyard. Okay. Let's go to, what did I want to say? Oh, when he was talking about eating the carrots, the outside was sweeter and the inside was juicier. Did anybody else ever do that? Like, I would eat the carrot all the way around so that nothing but the heart was left. And the heart was my favorite part. All righty. Shall we go on with chapter 10? Hey! All right, chapter 10, the turn of the year. Let me see how long this is. Okay. All right. Okay, chapter 10 it is. Oh, and by the way, you didn't get to see the picture. All right. Chapter 10, the turn of the year. The days were growing longer, but the cold was more intense. Father said, "When the days begin to lengthen, the cold begins to strengthen." And now you folks know where I got that. At last, the snow softened a little on the south and west slopes. At noon, the icicles dripped. Sap was rising in the trees, and it was time to make sugar. In the cold mornings just before sunrise, Almanzo and Father set out to the maple grove. Father had a big wooden yoke on his shoulders, and Almanzo had a little yoke. From the ends of the yokes hung strips of moosewood bark with large iron hooks on them, and a big wooden bucket swung from each hook. In every maple tree, Father had bored a small hole and fitted a little wooden spout into it. Sweet maple sap was dripping from the spouts into small pails. Going from tree to tree, Almanzo emptied the sap into his big buckets. The weight hung from his shoulders, but he steadied the buckets with his hands to keep them from swinging. When they were full, he went to the great cauldron and emptied them in it. The huge cauldron hung from a pole set between two trees. Father kept a bonfire blazing under it to boil the sap. Almanzo loved trudging through the frozen wild woods. He walked on snow that never had been walked on before, and only his own tracks followed behind him. Busily, he emptied the little pails into the buckets, and whenever he was thirsty, he drank some of the thin, sweet, icy cold sap. He liked to go back to the roaring fire. He poked it and saw the sparks fly. He warmed his face and his hands in the scorching heat and smelled the sap boiling. Then he went into the woods again. At noon, all the sap was boiling in the cauldron. Father opened the lunch pail, and Almanzo sat on the log beside him. They ate and talked. Their feet were stretched out to the fire, and a pile of logs was at their backs. All around them snow and ice and wild woods, but they were snug and cozy. After they had eaten, Father stayed by the fire to watch the sap, not add more. But Almanzo hunted wintergreen berries. Under the snow on the south slopes, the bright red berries were ripe among their thick green leaves. Almanzo took off his mittens and pawed away through the snow with his bare hands. He found the red clusters and filled his mouth full. The cold berries crunched between his teeth, gushing out their aromatic juice. Nothing else was ever so good as wintergreen berries dug out of the snow. Almanzo's clothes were covered with snow. His fingers were stiff and red with cold, but he never left the south slope until he had pawed it all over. When the sun was low behind the maple trunks, Father threw snow on the fire, and it died in sizzles and steam. Then Father dipped the hot syrup into the buckets, and he and Almanzo set their shoulders under the yokes again and carried the buckets home. They poured the syrup into Mother's big brass kettle on the cook stove. Then Almanzo began the chores while Father fetched the rest of the syrup from the woods. After supper, the syrup was ready to sugar off. Mother ladled it into 6-quart milk pans and left it to cool. In the morning, every pan held a big cake of solid maple sugar. Mother dumped out the Mother dumped out the round golden cakes and stored them on the top pantry shelves. Day after day, the sap was running, and every morning Almanzo went with Father to gather and boil it, and every night Mother sugared it off. They made all the sugar they could use next year. Then the last boiling of syrup was not sugared off. It was stored in jugs down cellar, and that was the year's syrup. When Alice came home from school, she smelled Almanzo and she cried out, "Oh, you've been eating wintergreen berries." She thought it wasn't fair that she had to go to school while Almanzo gathered sap and ate wintergreen berries. She said, "Boys have all the fun." She made Almanzo promise that he wouldn't touch the south slopes along Trout River beyond the sheep pasture. So on Saturdays, they went together to paw over those slopes. When Almanzo found a red cluster, he yelled, and when Alice found one, she squealed, and sometimes they divided, and sometimes they didn't. But they went on their hands and knees all over the south slopes, and they ate wintergreen berries all afternoon. Almanzo brought home a pail of the thick green leaves, and Alice crammed them into a big bottle. Mother filled the bottle with whiskey and set it away. That was her wintergreen flavoring for cakes and cookies. Every day the snow was melting a little. The cedars and the spruces shook it off, and it fell in blobs from the bare branches of oaks and maples and beeches. All along the walls of the barns and the house, the snow was pitted with water falling from icicles, and finally the icicles fell crashing. The earth showed in wet, dark patches. Where did I leave off, guys? What was the last thing you heard me read? I didn't see the phone lose. What happened? Okay, yeah, my phone dropped it. What was the last thing you heard me read? Wintergreen flavoring. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm bordering on trifocals, really. That was her wintergreen flavoring for cakes and cookies. Every day the snow was melting a little. The cedars and spruces shook it off, and it fell in blobs from the bare branches of oaks and maples and beeches. All along the walls of barns in the house, the snow was pitted with water falling from the icicles, and finally the icicles fell crashing. The earth showed in wet, dark patches here and there. The patches spread. Only the trodden paths were still white, and a little snow remained on the north sides of the buildings and woodpiles. Then the winter term of school ended, and spring had come. One morning, Father drove to Malone. Before noon, he came hurrying home and shouted the news from the buggy. The New York potato buyers were in town. Royal ran to help hitch up the team to the wagon, and Alice and Almanzo ran to get bushel baskets from the woodshed. They rolled them bumpity-bump down the cellar stairs and began filling them with potatoes as fast as they could. They filled 2 baskets before Father drove the wagon up to the kitchen porch. "Gracie, hush!" Howie's gone to get some wood, and she's like, "Why didn't you let me outside?" Then the race began. Father and Royal hurried the baskets upstairs and dumped them into the wagon, and Almanzo and Alice hurried to fill more baskets faster than they were carried away. Almanzo tried to fill more baskets than Alice, but he couldn't. She worked so fast, she was turning back to the bin while her hoop skirts were still swirling the other way. When she pushed back her curls, her hands left smudges on her cheeks. Almanzo laughed at her dirty face, and she laughed at him. "Look at yourself in the glass. You'd be dirtier than I be." Can you see that? They kept the baskets full. Father and Royal never had to wait. When the wagon was full, Father drove away in a hurry. It was mid-afternoon before he came back, but Royal and Almanzo and Alice had filled the wagon again while he ate some cold dinner, and he hauled another load away. That night, Alice helped Royal and Almanzo do the chores. Father was not there for supper. He did not come home before bedtime. Royal sat up to wait for him. Late in the night, Almanzo heard the wagon, and Royal went to help Father curry and brush the tired horses who had done 20 miles of hauling that day. The next morning and the next, they all began loading potatoes by candlelight, and Father was gone with the first load before sunrise. On the third day, the potato train left for New York City, but all of Father's potatoes were on it. 500 bushels at $1 a bushel, he said to Mother at supper. I told you when potatoes were cheap last fall, they'd be high in the spring. That was $500 in the bank. They were all proud of Father, who raised such good potatoes and knew so well when to store them and when to sell them. That's pretty good, Mom said, beaming. They all felt happy. But later, Mother said, well, now that's off our hands, we'll start house cleaning tomorrow, bright and early. Almanzo hated house cleaning. He had to pull up carpet tacks all around the edges of miles of carpet. Then the carpets were hung on clotheslines outdoors, and he had to beat them with a long stick. When he was little, he had run under the carpets playing they were tents, but now he was 9 years old. He had to beat those carpets without stopping till no more dust would come out of them. Everything in the house was moved. Everything was scrubbed and scoured and polished. All the curtains were down. All the feather beds were outdoors airing. All the blankets and quilts were washed. From dawn to dark, Almanzo was running, pumping water, fetching wood, spreading clean straw on the scrubbed floors, and then helping to stretch the carpets over it, and then tacking all those edges down again. Days and days he spent in the cellar. He helped Royal empty the vegetable bins. They sorted out every spoiled apple and carrot and turnip and put back the good ones into a few bins that Mother had scrubbed. They took down the other bins and stored them in the woodshed. They carried out crocks and jars and jugs till the cellar was almost empty. Then Mother scrubbed the walls and floor. Royal poured water into pails of lime, and Almanzo stirred the lime till it stopped boiling and was whitewash. Then they whitewashed the whole cellar. That was fun. Mercy on us, Mother said when they came upstairs. Did you get as much whitewash on the cellar as you did on yourselves? The whole cellar was fresh and clean and snow white when it dried. Mother moved her milk pans down to the scrubbed shelves. The butter tubs were scoured white with sand and dried in the sun, and Almanzo set them in a row on the clean cellar floor to be filled with the summer's butter. Outdoors, the lilacs and the snowball bushes were in bloom. Violets and buttercups were blossoming in the green pastures. Birds were building their nests, and it was time to work in the fields. Okay. Do you want one more? Because I owe you guys. Because we haven't done this over the holidays, and I missed it yesterday. So let's try and do 3 chapters, unless they're really, really long. Let's try and do 3 chapters every Saturday at 4 o'clock, okay? That's the new schedule. Chapter 11, Springtime. Now breakfast was eaten before dawn, and the sun was rising beyond the dewy meadows when Almanzo drove his team from the barns. He had to stand on an ox box to lift the heavy collars onto the horses' shoulders and to slip the bridles over their ears. But he knew how to drive. He had learned when he was little. Father wouldn't let him touch the colts, nor drive the spirited young horses. But now that he was old enough to work in the fields, he could drive the old gentle work team, Bess and Beauty. They were wise, sober mares. When they were turned out to pasture, they did not whinny and gallop like colts. They looked about them, lay down and rolled once or twice, and then fell to eating grass. When they were harnessed, they stepped sedately on behind the other. Okay. When they were harnessed, they stepped sedately one behind the other over the sill of the barn door, sniffing the spring air and waiting patiently for the traces to be fastened. They were older than Almanzo, and he was going on 10. They knew how to plow without stepping on corn or making the furrows crooked. They knew how to harrow and to turn at the end of the field. Almanzo would have enjoyed driving them more if they hadn't known so much. He hitched them to the harrow. Last fall, the fields had been plowed and covered with manure. Now the lumpy soil must be harrowed. Bess and Beauty stepped out willingly, not too fast, yet fast enough to harrow well. They liked to work in the springtime after the long winter of standing in their stalls. Back and forth across the field they pulled the harrow, while Almanzo walked behind it holding the reins. At the end of the row, he turned the team around and set the harrow so that the teeth barely overlapped the strip already harrowed. Then he slapped the reins of the horses' rumps and shouted, "Get up!" And away they went again. All over the countryside, other boys were harrowing too, turning up the moist earth to the sunshine. Far to the north, the St. Lawrence River was a silver streak at the edge of the sky. The woods were clouds of delicate green. Birds hopped twittering on the stone fences, and squirrels frisked. Almanzo walked away whistling behind his team. When he harrowed the field across one way, then he harrowed it across the other way. The harrow's sharp teeth combed again and again through the earth, breaking up the lumps. All the soil must be made mellow and fine and smooth. By and by, Almanzo was too hungry to whistle. He grew hungrier and hungrier. It seemed that noon would never come. He wondered how many miles he had walked, and still the sun seemed to stand still, and the shadows seemed not to change at all. He was starving. At last the sun stood overhead, and the shadows were quite gone. Almanzo harrowed another row and another. Then at last he heard the horns blowing far and near. Clear and joyful came the sound of Mother's big tin dinner horn. Sorry about that. Bess and Beauty pricked up their ears and stepped more briskly. At the edge of the field toward the house they stopped. Almanzo unfastened the traces and looped them up, leaving the harrow in the field. He climbed onto Beauty's broad back. He rode down to the pump house and let the horses drink. He put them in their stall, took off their bridles, and gave them their grain. A good horseman always takes care of his horses before he eats or rests. But Almanzo hurried. How good dinner was, and how he ate! Father heaped his plate again and again, and Mother smiled and gave him 2 pieces of pie. He felt better when he went back to work, but afternoon seemed much longer than the morning. He was tired when he rode down to the barns at sunset to do the chores. At supper he was drowsy, and as soon as he had eaten, he'd climb the stairs and went to bed. It was good to stretch out on the soft bed. Before he could pull up the coverlet, he fell fast asleep. In just a minute, Mother's candlelight shone on the stairs, and she was calling. Another day had begun. There was no time to lose, no time to waste in rest or play. The life of the earth comes up with a rush in the springtime, and all the wild seeds of weed and thistle, the sprouts of vine and bush and tree are trying to take the fields. Farmers must fight them with harrow and plow and hoe. They must plant the good seeds quickly. Almanzo was a little soldier in this great battle. From dawn to dark, he worked. From dark to dawn, he slept. And then he was up again working. He harrowed the potato field till the soil was smooth and mellow and every little sprouting weed was killed. Then he helped Royal take the seed potatoes from the bin in the cellar and cut them into pieces, leaving 2 or 3 eyes on each piece. Potato plants have blossoms and seeds, but no one knows what kind of potato will grow from a potato seed. All the potatoes of one kind that have ever been grown have come up from one potato. A potato is not a seed, it's part of a potato plant's root. Cut it up and plant it, and it will always make more potatoes just like itself. Unless they've been sprayed, folks. Every potato has several little dents in it that look like eyes. From these eyes, the little roots grow down into the soil and little leaves push up towards the sun. They eat up the piece of potato while they're small before they're strong enough to take their food from the earth and the air. Father was marking the field. The marker was a log with a row of wooden pegs driven into it 3.5 feet apart. One horse drew the log crosswise behind him, and the pegs made little furrows. Father marked the field lengthwise and crosswise, so the furrows made little squares. Then the planting began. Father and Royal took their hoes, and Alice and Almanzo carried pails full of pieces of potato. Almanzo went in front of Royal, and Alice went in front of Father. Down the rows at the corner of each square, where the furrows crossed, Almanzo dropped one piece of potato. He must drop it exactly in the corner so that the rows would be straight and could be plowed. Royal covered it with dirt and patted it firm with the hoe. Behind Alice, Father covered the pieces of potato that she dropped. Planting potatoes was fun. A good smell came from the fresh earth and from the clover fields. Alice was pretty and gay, with the breeze blowing her curls and setting her hoop skirts swaying. Father was jolly, and they all talked while they worked. Almanzo and Alice tried to drop the potato so fast that they'd have a minute at the end of the row to look for birds' nests or chase a lizard into the stone fence. But Father and Royal were never far behind. Father said, "Hustle along there, son, hustle along." So they hustled, and when they were far enough ahead, Almanzo plucked a grass stem and made it whistle between his thumbs. Alice tried, but she could not do that. She could pucker her mouth and whistle. Royal teased her. Whistling girls and crowing hens always come to some bad ends. Excuse me, I've got to adjust my seat. Oh! Back and forth across the field they went, all morning, all afternoon for 3 days. Then the potatoes were planted. Then Father sowed the grain. He sowed a field of wheat for white bread, a field of rye for rye Injun bread, and a field of oats mixed with Canada peas to feed the horses and cows next winter. While Father sowed the grain, Almanzo followed him over the fields with Bess and Beauty, harrowing the seeds into the earth. Almanzo could not sow grain yet. He must practice a long time before he could spread the seeds evenly. That is hard to do. The heavy sack of grain hung from a strap over Father's left shoulder. As he walked, he took handfuls of grain from the sack, and with a sweep of his arm and a bend of his wrist, he let the little grains fly from his fingers. The sweep of his arm kept time with his steps, and when Father finished sowing a field, every inch of the ground had its evenly scattered seeds, nowhere too many or too few. The seeds were too small to be seen on the ground, and you could not know how skillful a sower was. You could not know how skillful a man was till the seeds came up. Father told Almanzo about a lazy, worthless boy who had been sent to sow a field. This boy did not want to work, so he poured the seeds out of his sack and went swimming. Nobody saw him. Afterwards, he harrowed the field, and no one knew what he had done. But the seeds knew. And the earth knew. And when even the boy had forgotten his wickedness, they told it. Weeds took that field. When all the grain was sowed, Almanzo and Alice planted the carrots. They had sacks full of little red round carrot seeds hanging from their shoulders. like Father's big seed sack. Father had marked the carrot field lengthwise with a marker whose teeth were only 18 inches apart. Almanzo and Alice, with the carrot seeds, went up and down the long field, straddling the little furrows. Now the weather was so warm they could go barefoot. Their bare feet felt good in the air and the soft dirt. And they dribbled the carrot seeds into the furrows, and with their feet they pushed the dirt over the seeds and pressed it down. Almanzo could see his feet, but of course Alice's were hidden under her skirts. Her hoops rounded out, and she had to pull them back to stoop and drop the seeds neatly into the furrow. Almanzo asked if she didn't want to be a boy. She said yes, she did. Then she said no, she didn't. Excuse me, my nose is itchy. Boys aren't pretty like girls, she said, and can't wear ribbons. I don't care how pretty I be, said Almanzo, and I wouldn't wear ribbons anyhow. Well, I like to make butter, and I like to patch quilts, and cook and sew and spin. Boys can't do that, but even if I be a girl, I can drop potatoes and sow carrots and drive horses as well as you can. You can't whistle on a grass stem, Almanzo said. At the end of the row, he looked at the ash tree's crumpled new leaves and asked Alice if she knew when to plant corn. She didn't, so he told her. Corn planting time is when the ash leaves are as big as a squirrel's ears. How big a squirrel? Asked Alice. Just an ordinary squirrel. Well, those leaves are as big as a baby squirrel's ears, and that isn't corn planting time. For a minute, Almanzo didn't know what to think. Then he said, a baby squirrel isn't a squirrel, it's a kitten. But it's just as much a squirrel. No, it isn't. It's a kitten. Little cats are kittens, and little foxes are kittens, and little squirrels are kittens. A kitten isn't a cat, and a kitten isn't a squirrel either. Oh, said Alice. When the ash leaves were big enough, Almanzo helped to plant the corn. The field had been marked with the potato marker, and Father and Royal planted it together. They wore bags of seed corn tied around their waists like aprons, and they carried hoes. At the end corner of each square where the furrows were crossed, they stirred up the soil with the hoe and made a shallow hollow in it. Dropped 2 grains of corn into the hollow and covered them with the dirt and patted the dirt firm. Father and Royal worked fast. Their hands and their hoes made exactly the same movements every time. 3 quick slashes, and a dab with the hoe, a flash of the hand, then a scoop and 2 pats with the hoe. That hill of corn was planted. When they made 1 quick stride forward and did it again. But Almanzo had never planted corn before. He did not handle the hoe so well. He had to trot 2 steps where Royal and Father took 1, because his legs were shorter. Father and Royal were ahead of him all the time. He could not keep up. One of them finished out his row each time so that he could start even again. He did not like that, but he knew he would plant corn as fast as anybody when his legs were longer. How's it going, everybody? Let me change my eyes here. Thank you for joining me for 3 chapters of Little House Live, Day 16. Join me next week. Do we want to, again, there's really not a whole lot of discussion, but if you notice, the kids went to school. But they also worked the farm, right? And they did as much work as anybody. Little girls, little boys. But do you notice the chauvinism in that was back then? Well, you can't quilt, spin, or whatever, but I can do what you can do. You can't do what I can do. And it's not because he couldn't. It's because it just wasn't a guy thing to do. Now, I know male quilters now, right? Hi, Doris. You're welcome. Kids worked back then, right? You know, I mean, and you notice You consider how wealthy Almanzo's parents were in those days. Think about at that time, Laura was probably Little House in the Big Woods. She was maybe 4 years old, right? So, because he was like 5 years older than her in reality. And, they 500, Laura's family never saw $500 cash in a year. Never, right? And here, Pop put 500, Almanzo's dad put $500 in the bank just from selling potatoes. And they've raised everything except like things like store sugar. They raised their own flour. They never stopped, especially Mother. Mother was always cooking, cleaning, weaving. I mean, she wove and she spun her own thread, made her own cloth, and made their clothes, except for their Sunday best and the girls' dresses and stuff. But you know what I mean? Kids were taught the right way. Well, I mean, it all comes from us maybe taking. I tried that on my kids. And to this day, Arthur hates live chickens. Because at 6 years old, I tried to get him to feed and water the chickens every day. And he hated it. He hated it. So, I mean, it was kind of a failed experiment, right? Thank you, Helen, always being me. Thank you. Stop spamming caps. Right. All right. Listen, guys, I have to go make my birthday dinner. I've decided on chicken garlic pizza. So, no, it is not a video. There is no video for our half acre homestead tomorrow, except maybe a tea break. All right. So, anyway, we'll see you next Saturday, 4 p.m. for Little House Live. Day 17, starting with chapter 12, The Tin Peddler, one of my favorite chapters. That and the when the shoe guy comes. You have a great rest for your birthday, Bev. Thank you so much for reading to us. Now I know my kids. I know why my kids used to love it. There you go. This is Mrs. Wolfe from Reading with Beverly Wolfe saying, take care. God bless. See you next Saturday. Love you guys.